On a frozen Manhattan morning, a billionaire handed her platinum credit card to a homeless father just to see what he would buy. She expected greed, designer bags. Maybe he would disappear entirely. But over the next 24 hours, as she watched each transaction appear on her banking app, her hands began to shake. No luxury stores, no expensive restaurants, just heartbreakingly small numbers and one donation that made her throat close. The real shock came when she saw him again, a man so weak he nearly collapsed in front of her. What he bought with that money did not just shatter her assumptions about the poor, it exposed the cruelty of turning someone's suffering into a game. Eleanor Kensington had never believed in the goodness of strangers. At 29, she had inherited a real estate empire that spanned 3 states, sat on the board of 2 Fortune 500 companies, and lived in a penthouse where the monthly maintenance alone could feed a family for a year. She had learned early that people wanted things from her: money, access, a name that opened doors. She had also learned to keep those doors shut. The morning was brutal. Snow fell in thin, sharp lines across Fifth Avenue, and the wind cut through the expensive wool coats of everyone foolish enough to walk instead of ride. Eleanor was running late for a meeting with investors who had flown in from Singapore, and her driver had texted to say he was stuck in traffic near Columbus Circle. She decided to walk the 3 blocks to the cafe where her assistant had already ordered her usual oat milk latte. She hated being late. It made her feel ordinary. The cafe was warm and crowded, filled with the smell of roasted beans and the low hum of people pretending their problems mattered. She picked up her drink and turned toward the door, already composing an apology text in her head, when something made her stop. Across the street, beneath the awning of a closed bookstore, a man sat on the ground with a boy curled against his chest. The man was not holding a sign. He was not asking for anything. He was simply sitting there, his arms wrapped tightly around the child, his body angled to block the wind. The boy's face was buried in the man's jacket, which looked too thin for the weather and too worn to offer much warmth. Eleanor had seen homeless people before. Manhattan was full of them. She had trained herself not to look too closely, not to wonder too much, because wondering led to guilt, and guilt led nowhere useful. But this man was different. He was not slumped in defeat or shouting at passers-by or passed out on the sidewalk. He was awake, alert, protective. The way he held the boy reminded Eleanor of something she had not thought about in years, the way her own father used to hold her hand when she was small, before the money became more important than the people. She told herself to keep walking. The meeting was in 12 minutes. The investors would not wait, but her feet did not move. The man looked up, and their eyes met for just a second. He did not smile, or nod, or reach out. He simply looked at her, and then he looked away, as if he had already decided she was not worth the effort of hope. That should have been the end of it. Eleanor should have crossed the street, climbed into the back of a hired car when it finally arrived, and forgotten the man and the boy by the time she reached Midtown. But instead, she found herself walking toward them. The boy stirred as she approached, lifting his head slightly. He could not have been more than 7 years old. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his eyes were the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping well for a very long time. The man tightened his grip on the boy and straightened his back, as if preparing to be told to move along. Eleanor stopped a few feet away. She did not know what she was doing. She only knew that something about the man's expression, calm, resigned, but not broken, had hooked into her chest and would not let go. "What's your name?" she asked. The man blinked. He had not expected her to speak. "Jackson," he said quietly. His voice was rough but steady. "Jackson," Eleanor repeated. She glanced at the boy. "And him?" "Noah. My son." Eleanor nodded. She studied Jackson's hands, which were red and cracked from the cold, and the jacket that was doing almost nothing to protect him. She considered the $1,800 coat she was wearing and the heated seats in the Tesla that would arrive any minute. The meeting and the investors and the way her life had become a series of transactions where nothing was ever given without something expected in return crossed her mind. And then she did something she had never done before. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Inside was a black platinum credit card with her name engraved in small silver letters. She held it out toward Jackson. He stared at it but did not move. "Take it," Eleanor said. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "I want to see what you'll do with it." "What I'll do with it," Jackson repeated slowly, as if trying to translate the words into something that made sense. Eleanor felt a flicker of impatience. She was not used to having to explain herself. "You have 24 hours, she said. "Use it however you want. No limit. I just want to know what someone like you would buy if you had access to everything." Jackson glanced down at Noah, who had gone still and quiet in his arms. Then his gaze returned to Eleanor. His expression was unreadable. "This a joke?" he asked. "No." "Some kind of test?" "Maybe." Jackson's jaw tightened. Eleanor could see the wheels turning in his head, suspicion, confusion. And underneath it all, a flicker of something that looked like desperation. "What if I run?" Jackson asked. Eleanor shrugged. "Then you run. What if I max it out?" "Then you max it out." Jackson stared at the card again. His hands were shaking, but Eleanor could not tell if it was from the cold or something else. "Why me?" he asked. Eleanor did not have a good answer for that. The truth was, she did not know. Maybe it was the way he held his son. Maybe it was the fact that he had not asked her for anything. Maybe it was because she was tired of living in a world where everyone wanted something and no one ever surprised her. "Because I'm curious," she said finally. Jackson stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the card. His fingers brushed hers for just a second, and Eleanor felt the roughness of his skin, the cold that had settled deep into his bones. 24 hours, Eleanor said. She pulled a business card from her wallet and handed it to him. "Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. There's a laundromat on 8th Avenue near 34th Street. You know it?" Jackson nodded. "Good. Bring the card. And whatever you bought." She turned and walked away before he could say anything else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, her assistant, asking where she was. The meeting. The investors. The empire that required constant attention. She typed a quick response and kept walking. Behind her, Jackson sat frozen on the cold pavement, staring at the platinum card in his hand. Noah lifted his head and looked up at his father. "What is that?" the boy asked. Jackson did not answer right away. He was thinking about the woman who had just walked away, the way she had looked at him like he was some kind of experiment, and the way his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "I don't know," Jackson said quietly. He closed his fist around the card. "But we're going to find out." Jackson did not move for a full minute after Eleanor disappeared into the crowd. He sat on the cold pavement with Noah pressed against his chest and the platinum card burning a hole in his palm. The metal was still warm from her hand. He turned it over and saw her name embossed in silver letters. Eleanor Kensington. He had heard that name before, seen it in the business section of newspapers left on subway benches. Real estate. Billions. The kind of wealth that existed in a different universe from his own. Noah shifted in his arms and looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Dad, what are we going to do with it?" the boy asked. Jackson did not have an answer. He stared at the card and felt the weight of 24 hours pressing down on him like a physical thing. The memory surfaced of the last time he had held a credit card his own, years ago, before the construction company went under and his ex-wife took everything that mattered except Noah. The last meal he had eaten was half a sandwich from a church basement 3 days ago. Noah's cough had rattled through the night, and Jackson had no money for medicine. He stood up slowly, pulling Noah with him. His legs were stiff from sitting in the cold, and his head swam for a second before the world steadied. He looked down at his son and tried to smile. "We're going to be smart," Jackson said. "Real smart." They walked 10 blocks to the public library on 42nd Street. It was the one place in the city where they could sit for hours without being asked to leave, where it was warm and quiet, and Noah could read picture books while Jackson tried to figure out what to do next. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. Jackson found a table near the back and set Noah down with a stack of books about dinosaurs. Then he pulled out the battered phone he had salvaged from a dumpster 6 months ago. It barely held a charge, but the free Wi-Fi still worked. He searched for Eleanor Kensington's name and found dozens of articles. Heiress, philanthropist, CEO. Photos of her at charity galas in dresses that probably cost more than a car. He scrolled through images of her shaking hands with politicians and cutting ribbons at building openings, and he wondered what kind of person handed a stranger an unlimited credit card just to see what they would do with it. Then he searched for something else. Can you get arrested for using someone else's credit card? The results were not encouraging. Fraud, theft, criminal charges. Jackson's stomach twisted. His eyes went to Noah, who was tracing his finger over the picture of a triceratops, completely unaware that his father was holding what might be either a lifeline or a trap. But then Jackson recalled the way Eleanor had looked at him. Not with pity, not with disgust, with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or boredom. He could not tell. Either way, she had given him permission. She had said he could use it however he wanted. Jackson closed the browser and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His gaze drifted to Noah again, to the way the boy's ribs showed through his thin shirt, to the cough that had not gone away in weeks. He considered what it meant to be a father when you had nothing to give except your body as a shield against the cold. He made a decision. 2 hours later, Jackson stood in the fluorescent brightness of a Whole Foods on the Upper West Side. He had never been inside one before. The floors were too clean, the lights too bright, and the people pushing carts looked like they had never worried about money in their entire lives. Jackson held Noah's hand tightly and walked down an aisle filled with organic vegetables that cost more per pound than he used to make in an hour. He picked up a sandwich from the deli counter. Turkey and avocado on whole grain bread, $8.99. He added a carton of milk, a small container of strawberries, and a bottle of children's fever reducer because Noah's forehead had felt warm that morning. At the register, the cashier scanned each item slowly, and Jackson's heart hammered in his chest as he handed over the platinum card. The machine beeped. Approved. The cashier handed the card back without looking at him twice, and Jackson exhaled for the first time since entering the store. He walked out into the cold with a plastic bag in his hand and Noah at his side, and he felt like he had just robbed a bank. They ate the sandwich on a bench in Central Park. Jackson gave Noah most of it and told him he was not hungry, which was true in the way that lies can be true when you repeat them enough times. He watched his son eat and felt something unclench in his chest. Just a little. After that, Jackson walked to a Barnes & Noble near Union Square. The bookstore was enormous. 3 floors of shelves and reading nooks and the smell of new paper. Noah's eyes went wide the moment they stepped inside. Jackson led him to the children's section and told him to pick out 3 books. Any 3 he wanted. Noah chose a picture book about space, a chapter book about a boy who solved mysteries, and a workbook filled with math problems for second graders. Jackson added a box of colored pencils to the pile, then stood in front of the engineering section for a long time, staring at a book called Construction Basics for Modern Builders. It cost $29.99. He picked it up, held it for a moment, then put it back on the shelf. Not for me, he thought. This is for Noah. At the register, the total came to $76.49. The cashier smiled at Noah and asked if he liked to read. Noah nodded shyly and clutched the books to his chest like they might disappear if he let go. Jackson paid with the card and felt the weight of what he was doing settle deeper into his bones. By late afternoon, they were at a Target in Midtown. Jackson bought Noah a winter coat with a hood, a pair of sneakers that actually fit, and socks that did not have holes in them. He also bought himself a jacket because the one he had been wearing for 2 years was falling apart, the zipper broken and the lining torn. The new jacket was thin and cheap, $24.99, but it was better than nothing. The cashier asked if he wanted a gift bag. Jackson said no. He did not deserve gift bags. That night, Jackson sat on a bench outside Penn Station with Noah asleep against his shoulder. The boy was wearing his new coat and his new shoes, and he looked warmer than he had in months. Jackson held the platinum card in his hand and stared at it under the streetlights. Everything he had bought ran through his mind. Food, books, clothes, medicine, necessities, nothing extravagant, nothing selfish. And yet, he felt like a thief. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 12 hours left. He considered what he could do with 12 more hours and unlimited money. He could find a hotel room and sleep in a real bed. He could buy a meal that did not come from a convenience store or a soup kitchen. He could get his teeth checked because 2 of his molars ached every time he bit down. He could do all of that, but he did not. Instead, he stood up carefully so as not to wake Noah, and he walked 6 blocks to the public library. He found an empty computer terminal and accessed the online banking portal using the card information. The screen loaded slowly. Then numbers appeared. $2,847,592.33. Jackson stared at the screen, his vision blurred. What that much money could do flooded his thoughts. He imagined renting an apartment, buying a car, starting over. He considered taking $10,000, just $10,000, and disappearing before anyone noticed. It would be so easy. But then the image of Eleanor returned to him. Not with trust, exactly. With expectation. She was testing him. She wanted to see what kind of person he was when no one was watching. Jackson closed the browser window. He walked back to the bench where Noah was still sleeping and sat down heavily. His hands were shaking. He felt like he had just stood at the edge of a cliff and chosen not to jump. 3 hours later, Jackson made one more transaction. He used the library computer to transfer $200 from Eleanor's account to the City Harvest Food Bank, the organization that had kept him and Noah alive for the past 6 months. It was not much, not compared to what she had, but it was something. When he logged out, he sat back in the chair and closed his eyes. The total he had spent in 24 hours was $465.04. He had access to millions, and he had spent less than $500. He did not know if that made him noble or just a coward. Eleanor sat in her penthouse and watched the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was nearly midnight, and she could not sleep. She kept checking her phone, opening the banking app, scrolling through the transactions. Every time a new charge appeared, she felt her stomach tighten. The first transaction had come through 3 hours after she had given Jackson the card. Whole Foods, $36.78. Eleanor had stared at the notification for a full minute, trying to understand. Whole Foods was expensive, but $36 was nothing. A single grocery trip. Maybe he bought lunch. Then came Barnes & Noble. $76.49. Books, maybe. Or DVDs. She could not tell. Then Target. $151.77. Clothes, probably. Still reasonable. Still small. Eleanor kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. For a charge at Gucci or Tiffany or some luxury hotel. For the card to be maxed out on bottle service at a club or a shopping spree at Saks. That was what people did when they suddenly had access to money, was it not? They took everything they could get. But Jackson was not doing that. By the time the sun came up, Eleanor had barely slept. She sat at her kitchen island with a cup of coffee she had not touched and stared at the final transaction that had come through at 11:47 p.m. City Harvest Food Bank. $200. A donation. Eleanor's throat tightened. She scrolled back through the list of charges and added them up in her head. Less than $500. He had spent less than $500. The image of Jackson when she handed him the card returned to her mind. Suspicious. Desperate. Afraid. The boy in his arms. The way Jackson had held him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. And the fact that in 24 hours, with access to millions, Jackson had bought food and books and clothes for his son, and nothing for himself except a cheap jacket. Eleanor set her phone down and pressed her hands against her face. She felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept locked away for a very long time. It was not pity. It was something worse. It was shame. The next afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the laundromat on 8th Avenue 15 minutes early. The place smelled like detergent and damp fabric, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A few people sat folding clothes or staring at their phones while machines churned in the background. Eleanor stood near the door and waited. Jackson arrived exactly at 2 p.m. He was carrying a plastic bag in one hand and holding Noah's hand with the other. The boy was wearing a new coat, and his cheeks were less red than they had been the day before. Jackson appeared tired but steady. He walked up to Eleanor and held out the platinum card. "Thank you," Jackson said quietly. "Here's your card. I spent $465.04. If you want, I can pay it back." Eleanor took the card and studied him. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged slightly, the faint tremor in his hands. "What did you buy?" Eleanor asked. Jackson gestured to the bag. "Food, books for Noah, some clothes, a coat, and I donated $200 to the food bank that's been helping us." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the bag, then returned to Jackson. "Nothing for yourself?" Jackson hesitated. "I bought a jacket. Mine was falling apart." "That's it?" "That's it." Eleanor felt the words catch in her throat. She wanted to ask why. Why he had not bought more. Why he had not taken advantage. Why he had spent almost nothing when he could have spent everything. But she could see the answer in his face. He had been afraid. Afraid of being caught. Afraid of being selfish. Afraid of wanting too much. "You didn't have to give it back," Eleanor said. Jackson frowned. "Yes, I did." Eleanor opened her mouth to say something else. But before she could, Jackson swayed on his feet. His face went pale, and his knees buckled. Eleanor lunged forward and caught him by the arm, barely keeping him upright. "Jackson," she said sharply. He tried to straighten, but his legs would not cooperate. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was cold to the touch. Noah grabbed his father's other arm, his small face twisted with panic. "Dad," the boy said. "Dad, are you okay?" Jackson did not answer. His eyes rolled back slightly, and Eleanor knew with sudden, terrible clarity that something was very wrong. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, clipped, efficient as she gave the address and described the situation. Then she eased Jackson down onto one of the plastic chairs and knelt in front of him. "Stay with me," Eleanor said. "Help is coming." Jackson's eyes focused on her for a moment. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Eleanor could see his ribs through his shirt. She could see the hollow places in his cheeks and the bruises under his eyes that came from weeks or months of not eating enough. And she realized, with a sick feeling in her stomach, that Jackson had spent 24 hours with unlimited money, and he had not bought himself a single proper meal. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Paramedics loaded Jackson onto a stretcher and asked Eleanor if she was family. She said yes without thinking. The paramedics, perhaps sensing the urgency or choosing not to press, nodded and let her ride with Noah in the back. At the hospital, a doctor with tired eyes and graying hair examined Jackson and ran a series of tests. Eleanor sat in the waiting room with Noah beside her, the boy clutching one of his new books and staring at the floor. An hour later, the doctor came out and motioned for Eleanor to follow him into the hallway. "He's severely malnourished," the doctor said. "Dehydrated, low blood sugar. His body's been running on empty for a long time. Another week or two like this, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. "Will he be okay? We're giving him fluids and starting him on a treatment plan. He'll recover, but he needs rest, proper nutrition, and follow-up care. Does he have insurance?" Eleanor shook her head. "I'll cover it." The doctor nodded and walked away. Eleanor stood in the hallway and stared at the pale green walls. Jackson, sitting on the cold pavement with his son in his arms, came back to her. The $465 he had spent in 24 hours, the way he had handed the card back to her and offered to pay it back, even though he had nothing. And the fact that she had given him the card as a test, as an experiment, as a way to satisfy her curiosity about what poor people would do if they suddenly had money. She had treated his suffering like entertainment. Eleanor walked back to the waiting room and sat down next to Noah. The boy looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Is my dad going to die?" Noah asked. Eleanor's throat tightened. "No. He's going to be okay. Noah nodded and went back to staring at his book. Eleanor sat beside him in the uncomfortable plastic chair and realized that everything she thought she knew about people had just been proven wrong by a man who had spent less than $500 when he could have spent millions. Eleanor did not leave the hospital for 3 days. She paid for a private room, which the hospital staff seemed surprised by but did not question. She arranged for Noah to stay with her in a nearby hotel at night, where he slept in a bed that was probably larger than any he had ever seen. During the day, she brought him back to the hospital, where he sat quietly beside his father's bed and read his new books or drew pictures with his colored pencils. Jackson slept most of the first 2 days. The doctors said his body was catching up on months of deprivation, that sleep was part of the healing. Eleanor sat in a chair by the window and watched him breathe, watched the IV drip fluid into his veins, watched the color slowly return to his face. The $465 returned to her mind. The $200 donation, the fact that she had turned a man's suffering into a game and called it curiosity. On the 3rd day, Jackson woke up. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, and he looked around the room with confusion until his gaze landed on Noah, who was asleep in the chair beside the bed. Then he saw Eleanor. "You're still here," Jackson said. His voice was hoarse. Eleanor set down the magazine she had been pretending to read. "Where else would I be?" Jackson studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was real. "You paid for this." "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor did not have a good answer. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable, and she was not sure she fully understood it herself. So she said the simplest version, "Because you needed help." Jackson closed his eyes. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity. It's a hospital bill. I can afford it. You can't." Jackson's jaw tightened. Eleanor could see the pride and shame battling in his expression, the way his hands clenched the thin hospital blanket. She had seen that look before, in boardrooms and negotiations, the look of someone who knew they had lost but refused to admit it. "I'll pay you back," Jackson said. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "With what?" Jackson opened his eyes and met her gaze. The anger in his face was undercut by exhaustion, by the reality that he had no answer to that question. His attention shifted away. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I will." Eleanor stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved at its usual frantic pace, people rushing from place to place as if every second mattered. Her own life crossed her mind, the endless meetings and deals and acquisitions, the constant motion that kept her from having to think too much about what any of it meant. "When I gave you that card," Eleanor said, still looking out the window, "I thought I was testing you. I thought I'd find out what kind of person you were. Whether you'd be greedy, whether you'd steal, whether you'd prove that people are exactly as selfish as I've always believed." She turned to face him. Jackson was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "But you didn't do any of that," Eleanor continued. "You spent less than $500. You bought food and books and clothes for your son. You donated money to a food bank. And you didn't buy yourself a single meal." Jackson's gaze dropped to his hands. "I wasn't hungry." "You were starving," Eleanor said. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "The doctor said another week or 2 and you would have been in serious trouble. You could have died, Jackson. And you had access to millions of dollars." Jackson did not respond. Noah stirred in his sleep, and Jackson's eyes immediately went to his son, checking to make sure he was okay. Eleanor saw the instinct in that movement. The way Jackson's entire existence was calibrated around protecting the boy. "Why didn't you buy yourself anything?" Eleanor asked. Jackson was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm used to it," he said. "I'm used to being hungry. I'm used to being cold. I'm used to not having enough. But Noah shouldn't have to be used to it. He's 7 years old. He should get to be a kid. So if I only had one chance to buy something, I was going to make sure it was for him." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. She sat back down in the chair and studied Jackson, really studied him, and saw not a test subject or an experiment, but a man who had been so thoroughly broken by poverty that he no longer believed he deserved to survive. "That's not how it's supposed to work," Eleanor said quietly. Jackson gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, a lot of things aren't how they're supposed to work." Her penthouse came to mind, her cars, her closet full of clothes she had worn once and forgotten. The ease with which she moved through the world surfaced in her thoughts, the way doors opened and problems disappeared because she had money. How little she had ever questioned that ease. How she had always assumed it was something she had earned rather than something she had been born into. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. Jackson frowned. "For what?" "For treating you like an experiment. For thinking I had the right to test you. For not understanding what I was really doing." Jackson met her eyes, and for the first time, something softened in his expression. "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse." Jackson shrugged slightly. "Maybe not. But it's something." They sat in silence for a moment. Noah woke up, rubbing his eyes, and saw his father looking at him. The boy's face lit up, and he scrambled out of the chair to stand beside the bed. "Dad," Noah said. "You're awake." Jackson smiled. And it was the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Noah nodded. "Miss Eleanor got us a hotel room. It has a TV and everything." Jackson glanced at Eleanor, and she saw the conflict in his face. Gratitude mixed with discomfort. The knowledge that he owed her something he could never repay. "We need to talk," Eleanor said. "About what happens next." Jackson's expression closed off again. "We'll figure it out." "I have a proposal," Eleanor said. She had been thinking about this for the past 3 days, turning it over in her mind, trying to find the right way to say it. "I want to offer you a job." Jackson stared at her. "A job? You told me you used to be a construction engineer." "I own a real estate development company. We're always looking for project managers. People who understand building codes and timelines and how to keep contractors in line. It's not charity. It's a real position. You'd have to work for it." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're qualified. Because I need good people. And because I think you deserve a chance to get back on your feet." Jackson shook his head. "I've been out of the field for 3 years. I don't have references. I don't have an address. I don't even have a working phone." Eleanor crossed her arms. "So we'll get you an address. We'll get you a phone. We'll deal with the references, unless you'd rather go back to sleeping under bridges." Jackson flinched at that, and Eleanor immediately regretted the harshness of her words. But before she could apologize, Jackson spoke. "What about Noah?" he asked. "What about him? He needs to be in school. He needs stability. I can't drag him around the city while I'm working." Eleanor had already considered this. "There's a good public school 3 blocks from the apartment I'm offering you. I'll cover the first 3 months of rent, and after that, it comes out of your salary. You'll have health insurance, benefits, the whole package. Noah can enroll as soon as you're ready." Jackson's attention shifted to Noah, who was watching the conversation with wide, uncertain eyes. Then he returned his focus to Eleanor. "This isn't a handout," Eleanor said firmly. "This is a job. You'll work for everything you get. If you don't perform, you're out. But if you do the work, you'll earn a real living. You'll have a real life." Jackson's throat worked as he swallowed. His hands were shaking again, and Eleanor could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride versus desperation. Self-reliance versus the crushing need for help. "I don't want to owe you," Jackson said. "You won't. You'll earn it." Jackson closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there were tears on his lashes, but his voice was steady. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll take the job." Eleanor nodded. She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight for as long as she could remember. "Good. We start as soon as you're cleared by the doctors." Noah looked up at his father, his small face breaking into a smile. "Does that mean we get to stay in a real house?" Jackson's voice cracked when he answered. "Yeah, buddy. We get to stay in a real house." 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of a small apartment in Brooklyn and watched Jackson and Noah move through their new space like they still could not quite believe it was real. The apartment was nothing fancy. Just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with appliances that actually worked. But the windows let in sunlight, and the heat worked, and there was a lock on the door that kept the world out. Noah was at the kitchen table doing homework, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he worked through a math problem. Jackson was in the kitchen, pulling ingredients out of the refrigerator. He had gained back the weight he had lost, and the hollow look in his eyes had faded. He moved with purpose now, with the confidence of someone who had a reason to get up in the morning. Eleanor had brought pizza, even though Jackson had insisted she did not need to. She set the box on the counter and watched as Jackson pulled plates from the cabinet. Real plates, not paper or plastic. "How's the job going?" Eleanor asked. Jackson smiled. "Good. Really good. We finished the framing on the Tribeca project ahead of schedule. I heard. Your supervisor said you've been doing excellent work." Jackson shrugged, but Eleanor could see the pride in his expression. "I'm just doing what I know how to do." Noah looked up from his homework. "Miss Eleanor, do you want to see my science project?" Eleanor smiled. "I'd love to." Noah scrambled off his chair and ran to his room, returning a moment later with a cardboard model of the solar system. He launched into an enthusiastic explanation of each planet, complete with facts about size and distance from the sun. Eleanor listened and nodded and asked questions, and she realized that this, more than any board meeting or business deal, felt like something real. When Noah finished his presentation and returned to his homework, Jackson brought the pizza to the table and they sat down together. It was a simple meal, nothing elegant or complicated. But as Eleanor surveyed the small kitchen, watching Jackson and Noah laughing over something silly, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was part of something that mattered. Jackson caught her eye and smiled. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For all of this." Eleanor shook her head. "You earned it. Maybe. But you gave me the chance." The morning she had handed him the credit card surfaced in her memory, the test she had designed without thinking about what it would cost him. The $465 and the hospital room and the way Jackson had almost died because he believed he did not deserve to eat. "You taught me something," Eleanor said, "about what it means to be human, about what people do when they have nothing and what they'll sacrifice when they love someone. I thought I was testing you, but you were teaching me." Jackson held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, and they went back to eating pizza in the warm apartment while Noah chattered about his day at school. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and relentless. But inside that small kitchen, 3 people who had saved each other from their own kinds of cold sat together and built something new from kindness. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor understood that wealth was not measured in dollars. It was measured in moments like this, in the sound of a child laughing and the knowledge that you had helped someone stand when they had forgotten how. The rest was just numbers on a screen.